I first met Mrs. Evelyn when I joined high school. She was in her early 50s back then, a woman whose presence commanded respect. Her sharp wit and intellectual depth made her stand out among the other teachers. Time passed, and after graduation, I lost touch with most of my teachers. Life happened, and I pursued my career. A decade later, I found myself back in my hometown, where memories of the past often resurfaced. One rainy evening, while walking down the streets of my old neighborhood, I saw her. She was sitting by the window of a quiet cafe, sipping tea, her glasses perched on her nose, engrossed in a book. It took me a moment to realize it was Mrs. Evelyn. She had aged, of course, but there was something timeless about her. Her silver hair was styled in a neat bun, and her soft wrinkles only added grace to her face. Without a second thought, I walked into the cafe, and before I knew it, I was standing at her table. "Mrs. Evelyn," I asked softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, her deep blue eyes sparkling with recognition. "Well, look who it is," she said, a warm smile spreading across her face. "I haven't seen you in years. How have you been?" We talked for hours, reminiscing about the past and catching up on life. There was something comforting about her presence. Like returning to a place you once knew but seeing it in a new light. As the evening wore on, the rain stopped, and we parted ways, but not before she gave me her number. Over the next few weeks, we began meeting more often. Diners, long walks, and discussions that lasted late into the night. I found myself looking forward to our time together. It wasn't long before I started seeing her in a different light. The years had changed her physically, yes, but her mind was as sharp as ever. Her laugh was infectious, her stories captivating. I realized that the admiration I had for her as a student had grown into something deeper. Something I couldn't quite put into words yet. One evening, we found ourselves at her home. It was cozy, filled with books and memories of a life well lived. We sat in the living room, sipping wine, the conversation flowing effortlessly. As the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted, becoming more intimate. There was a long pause between us, and I found myself unable to look away from her. She set her glass down and turned to me, her gaze soft but intense. "There's something I've been wanting to talk to you about," she began, her voice steady, yet filled with an emotion I couldn't place. I stayed silent, my heart racing. "I've always valued our connection," she continued. "Even back when you were my student, but these past few weeks, I felt something more." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I could feel my pulse quicken, the room suddenly feeling much smaller. She took a deep breath and leaned in slightly, her hand resting lightly on mine. "I know this might sound strange given our history, but I can't ignore it anymore." Her confession was like a spark, igniting feelings I had been trying to suppress. I realized then that I had fallen for her, deeply, irrevocably. The age gap didn't matter, our past as teacher and student didn't matter. All that mattered was the connection we had now. I moved closer, closing the space between us. Her hand trembled slightly as I took it in mine, but her eyes never wavered. There was a vulnerability there, a shared understanding of the risks we were taking. But there was also desire, a deep, unspoken longing that had been building between us. "I feel the same," I whispered, barely able to believe the words as they left my mouth. For a moment she looked surprised, but then her face softened and a slow smile spread across her lips. The next thing I knew, we were kissing. It was slow at first, tentative, as if we were both testing the waters. But soon, the kiss deepened, becoming more passionate. Her lips were soft, and I could taste the wine on her breath. I pulled her closer, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. It felt right, like this was something that had been meant to happen for a long time. The kiss lasted forever, or so it seemed, but when we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. She looked at me with a mixture of relief and desire. "I didn't think I could ever feel this way again," she said quietly, almost to herself. Neither did I. But as we sat there, our hands intertwined, the reality of our situation began to sink in. We weren't just two people caught up in a moment of passion. This was something more, something real. And it scared me, just as I could tell, it scared her. But there was no turning back now. From that night on, our relationship changed. We became inseparable, spending almost every evening together. We would have long, passionate conversations about life, love, and everything in between. Sometimes we would sit in comfortable silence, simply enjoying each other's company. And when the silence grew too thick, our bodies would find each other, drawn together by a force that neither of us could explain. It wasn't just physical, though that was undeniably a part of it. It was emotional. She filled a void in my life that I hadn't even realized was there. And I did the same for her. We were two people from different worlds, different times, yet somehow we fit together perfectly. But as with all things, reality eventually intruded. We had to be careful, cautious about who knew about us. Our age difference, our past as teacher and student, it would be too much for some to understand. And while part of me wanted to shout from the rooftops about how I felt, I knew we had to keep this to ourselves, at least for now. As time went on, we grew more comfortable in our secret. The moments we shared became more meaningful, each kiss deeper, each touch more tender. We knew the risks, but we were willing to take them, because what we had was worth it. And so our story continued, slow and steady, like the turning of pages in a book. There was no rush, no need to reach the climax too soon. We savored every moment, every stolen glance, every whispered word. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And that was enough. One evening, as we lay together in the dim glow of her bedroom, our bodies entwined, Mrs. Evelyn suddenly sat up, her eyes brimming with an intensity one hadn't seen before. She took my hand, squeezing it tightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't keep this a secret forever," she said, her tone filled with both urgency and fear. "I don't want to hide anymore. I want you, all of you, out in the open." Her vulnerability struck me, and for the first time I realized just how much this relationship meant to her, how much it had come to mean to me. But the weight of the world felt heavier than ever. I knew what she was asking, what it would cost us both to step into the light. Yet staring into her eyes, I realized there was no turning back. Without another word, I kissed her fiercely, as if the world outside our little sanctuary no longer existed. It was a kiss full of promise, full of everything unspoken between us. At that moment, I knew we were bound by something deeper than love, something that transcended time, age, and the past. Together we would face whatever came, consequences be damned. Our love was worth the risk. As the night deepened, we lay there in the quiet aftermath, her head resting on my chest, the rhythm of our breathing slowly sinking. The world outside felt distant, as if it couldn't touch us in the safety of this moment. But beneath the calm, I could feel the tension building, the inevitable storm that would come once we stepped outside. Still, I tightened my arms around her, silently vowing to protect what we had, no matter the cost. Mrs. Evelyn glanced up at me, her eyes searching mine, and in that brief exchange, I knew we both understood the gravity of what lay ahead. But for now, in this fragile, stolen moment, none of it mattered. All that existed was us.